Have a look here around the exhaust tailpipe. Looks like some silver spaghetti. You'll notice the dog is in its incomplete state, hasn't got the tail attached. Not the best drawing, to be honest. It's a wing section, but it's pointing upwards. 50 degrees centigrade track temperature. In American, that's very hot. Answers on a postcard for that one. It's the Austrian Grand Prix, the sun is shining pretty much everywhere in Europe in fact, and the Red Bulls are out to play. And I'm not just talking about the bovine life behind the Turn 1 grandstand, I am of course talking about the Red Bull racing cars. When they finally did make it out on track in Free Practice 1, they were in heavily updated trim, and they were not the only ones. This is Tech Talk, and coming up we've got a great selection of interesting bits and bobs for you to take a look at. Well, we're at the Red Bull Ring, so where else should we start than Red Bull Racing? After all, it would be rude not to take a look at Max Verstappen's heavily upgraded car. And here it is, and I can show you just from this shot quite a few areas of the car that have been upgraded. Take a look here. You can see very subtly a change to the side pod inlet structure and to the front suspension, and then to the leading edge of the floor, then to the rest of the floor, and then to the side pod itself, and then the rear suspension and the rear of the floor. They haven't changed the rear wing, but you'll notice the dog is in its incomplete state, hasn't got the tail attached. Quite a lot of bubbles there. Let's take a closer look in a bit more detail at some of these changes, because that really didn't instruct us anywhere. So the fairings around the structural part of the wishbones have been wasted slightly differently than we've seen in other races. But for me, the really exciting, interesting section of the car here is the inboard pickup point on the upper wishbone, the rear leg of it. You can't really see it in this shot particularly well, but when we take a different look, you can see here how the inner pickup point has a slightly downward facing sculpted section where it meets the main part of the bodywork. And that's really quite interesting, because that goes against the current trend in design terms of this part of the car. Let's take a look at the Mercedes solution here, which Mercedes has had for some time, and you can see the exact opposite is true. The rear section of the wishbone has an upwards, almost wing-like section on the inner mounting point. You can also see that on the lower section as well, and all of the wishbone mounting points, apart from these ones up at the top, have a very different concept. But Red Bull there going a completely different direction, quite literally trying to get the airflow to do something clearly a bit different. Now, the problem when you're looking at parts like this, it's a really complicated area of the car, and you can't just say, oh, it points downward, therefore they're trying to generate downwash or do something clever with the suspension fairing, because actually it's all interrelated with the inlet duct on the side pod, and that has been changed quite significantly. It doesn't look it, it's still the same concept, it's still the same shape, but when you look rearwards on the side pod, you start to notice something. Yes, it still has this big hump on the side in a little bit of a valley between the main section of the bodywork and the outer section, but look here, it's almost like a vertical cliff running down the side of the car. All of that side pod undercut has been removed. Let's look at it from a different angle here, and you can see that it's almost just a straight wall now up here, and that undercut that we used to see down here, that's all being completely removed. Red Bull clearly going a very different direction with the airflow around the side of the car. And to put that into context, take a look at the Mercedes undercut here earlier in the pit lane in Austria, and you can see how deeply undercut the Mercedes side pods really are. So a very different design concept to what Red Bull are going for. But what I find quite interesting, in pre-season testing, Red Bull had a very slab-sided side pod to start the season off with this new car. And then they went for an undercut design, and now they've gone back to that slab-sided concept. So clearly a little bit of a lack of design consensus at this point. But I think it's all part of a more comprehensive package for Red Bull. Now, I mentioned there are changes to the floor on the Red Bull, and the leading edge of the floor, these lovely slatted sections. You might want to call them barge boards. I guess we're sort of going to have to pick a name for them, and barge boards does seem like the obvious one to use. Look at the shape of the leading edges of these elements around the front of the floor. Now, you can see their section is a wing section, but it's pointing upwards. Quite an interesting bit of solution that, and I'd love to see the CFD around this, how it actually works, because it is mind-bogglingly complicated when you start to look at all of these different sections, and these have got very three-dimensional cross sections. You can't really see what it's doing underneath here on the floor, but there are all lovely bits of sculpting along here and different multiple levels of complexity along these parts, and this is still a big area of development for every single car. So Red Bull making a big investment on that, and again that's working in conjunction with that changed front suspension, but also back here on the slab-sided sidepod, which you can really see quite clearly there, and then of course all the way down to the rear corner of the car, the rear floor, where all of the teams are concentrating. So big changes here. Again, we didn't really get to see in free practice 1 how potent it was, because both Verstappen and Hadjar were really struggling to get the most out of the car, both reporting vibrations, both struggling to get out of the garage. So a lot more to come from Red Bull, I think, in terms of that. But as we move rearwards on the car, we start to see other little details. There have been some changes to the rear suspension, but have a look here around the exhaust tailpipe. You can start to see what looks like some silver spaghetti. Well, Red Bull running some sensors around the rear wing supports and also around what is officially an exhaust tailpipe bracket to support it. Well, I think we know by now that's all about aerodynamics. Here you can see Red Bull has once again revised their exhaust tailpipe bracket, which on the Ferrari isn't a bracket, it's an aerodynamic part. On the Red Bull, it's a bracket, and you can see all of that sensor housing, all of those cables going into it, and there's clearly a sensor mounted in the exhaust tailpipe here to see what's going on with the exhaust gas pressure, and Red Bull just trying to find their way with this new area of technical development. Haven't actually seen one of these exhaust probes being used in F1 this season yet, but it's a bit messy, but I suspect that we'll see other teams using this solution. And if Red Bull are the first to use it, everybody likes to copy each other in Formula 1, don't they? It's been going on for years. But around the back of the Red Bull, it is always nice to look at Red Bull's diffuser, because they don't like us looking, so we like to take a closer look. Now, I mean, it's always there in the pit lane, but you can see some of the interesting, intricate details around here on the inner edge of the rear wheels, and you can see some of the little cutouts, all of these little details around the edges of the diffuser, all of these little components, how Red Bull is just trying to find every little area. Now, the real reason I'm showing you this diffuser on the Red Bull is that I want you to look at the diffuser on the Mercedes, because that has changed quite significantly for Mercedes, and Mercedes has changed this section of the diffuser after a few teams took a look at their previous design, had a few conversations, and well, Mercedes seems to have decided to change to a couple of little fairly simple tabs in the trailing edge of the upper surface of the diffuser just here. Now, these tabs are nowhere near as complicated as what Mercedes was running before, which kind of look like their hair on a cartoon character popular in the 1990s. Answers on a postcard for that one. But that's all gone away, and they've gone for the slightly more simplistic version, which have those little tabs here. That's the old version you can see there. And this diffuser development is also just being underpinned by just a lot of work. Here's the Red Bull again, and then let's just take a look back at the Mercedes, because these changes on the Mercedes have seen the team really want to study what's going on around the center line of the car. Mercedes, of course, has one of those plates at the tailpipe, but they've also fitted for free practice 1 this sensor array where you can see some of the airflow sensors in the wake of the exhaust tailpipe, but also interacting with all of the other stuff going along around the middle of the car. Now, I've never seen a sensor array of this particular type before mounted behind the exhaust tailpipe, so that's a pretty new area of exploitation or exploration for the teams, and I wonder when all of the other teams see this fit to the back of the Mercedes, they're going, oh, that's a neat idea, let's buy us one of those. So I expect to see quite a few more of these appearing on the cars in free practices in the rest of the season to come. Now, staying around the back of cars, because, you know, it's fun, McLaren was supposed to introduce one of these rotisserie flippy over wings that Red Bull and Ferrari have got, and it's on their upgrade document. However, they turned up in free practice 1 with no new wing at all, so perhaps that didn't work after all. McLaren were planning not to race it, but just to experiment with it, as they always do, before bringing it back later in the season, but they obviously didn't. So from the back of the McLaren to the back of the grid, Cadillac. The American team is the newest team in Formula 1, and to say they're on the back of the grid isn't unfair. They've just got a lot of building work to do, and what they've done so far is already pretty impressive. And the package they brought to Austria is the biggest package for any team on the grid, with the exception of Red Bull. Changing the sidepod inlet ducts, though it's a pretty similar concept to what they had before. However, as we move around the car, you start to see some different concepts and different elements to the Cadillac bodywork, as long as it stays attached to this car, which hasn't always been easy for this team. Still some work to do there for the new team. Now, the shrouds around the roll hoop section of the car. Now, the structural part of the roll hoop is that A section in the middle. That sort of carbon fibre shroud is around a metal structure that sits on a pillar on top of the monocoque just behind the driver's head. And these roll hoop sections are there simply to protect the driver in the event of the car flipping over. And they look roughly like that. Not the best drawing, to be honest, but that's sort of what they look like. A whole selection of yellow lines behind Sergio Perez's head. No, they're made of metal, but they're shrouded in carbon fibre. And for this weekend, Cadillac has actually changed the shrouding around it. And that's a relatively unusual change to see teams make during the season. But nonetheless, that's the direction they've chosen to go in. And we can take a look at that from a slightly different angle here. From the side on, you can start to see a few of the other things that have changed around the side of the Cadillac. Now, this is the fairing here that's been changed and the shape of the roll hoop supports. This actually does have quite a big aerodynamic effect because you have to remember this is a low pressure area where the driver's head is, and the airflow comes in, goes around the driver's helmet, and then you've got the low pressure area from the cockpit, and then you've got all of the air going into the airbox. You want to keep that nice and clean to get good flow into the plenum, but you've also got the coolers located under the bodywork, which are fed by those two segments outside the roll hoop. And then you've got this section behind. Now, some teams have a little cooling inlet just there, but also the airflow is coming in here and then out around the sort of centre line of the car. And when you take a look from behind, you can see that behind this, you really want the airflow going down here because directly behind that, well, it's going to interact with the rear wing, and that's a crucial downforce contributor. But looking at the car from this angle, we can see a few other changes made to the Cadillac, most notably the cooling outlets here. Now, it's particularly hot in Austria. In Austria, it isn't a circuit that has a massively high average speed. So with 50 degrees centigrade track temperature, in American that's very hot, you would expect to see a lot of cars running quite open bodywork, but Cadillac, going the opposite direction, seem to have closed up the bodywork apart from when it removes itself. And you can see looking from the rear of the car that it has pretty closed up side pods along with these two cooling outlets either side of the car, then cooling louvres near the front of the side pod. In fact, the whole engine covered shape has changed ever so slightly on this car. And when we take a look at the car from the same angle but at a different race, in this case Monaco, very low average speed but not a particularly hot race this year, look how open the bodywork is. It's covered in these louvres all the way along the engine covers. But you'll also notice that alongside those big cooling louvres, there's no opening on the leading edge of the side pods. Those optional panels aren't being used in that configuration, but that's not always the case with Cadillac. Take a look here at another race earlier this season. The car still has those very big open cooling louvres, though perhaps not as open as Monaco, but also one of the side pod cooling louvre sections opened as well. And that again was a circuit with a lower ambient temperature than we're seeing at Austria. And here's the Austrian configuration. Again, it looks very low drag, almost like a Monza configuration almost, with the bodywork quite closed up. And that suggests to me that Cadillac may have made some more changes underneath the bodywork to the car to make it slightly more efficient in terms of its cooler design. And that's something teams can make a lot of development on without taking away from their wind tunnel time, because cooling optimization, as long as it's not the external bodywork, doesn't come out of your wind tunnel and CFD allocation. So it could have been quite a big step forward under the bodywork. And we are seeing some big step forwards under the bodywork at this point of the season. And we're going to go into it in a bit more detail in a future episode of Tech Talk. But Ferrari, the company that supplies Cadillac's engines, has introduced a massively upgraded power unit, as did Audi at the Barcelona Grand Prix. And there's a few more development parts to come underneath the bodywork for all of these teams. And what's going to make the big difference? Well, we're really going to have to wait and see. But there's so much more to see up and down the grid, but we don't quite have time for it today. But don't worry, we're not going to stop doing stuff here on Tech Talk. We've got some really special content coming up for you. And, well, what about that special Audi episode? We haven't forgotten about it. It is coming for you very soon. Thanks for watching.